What if I told you that some of the darkest punishments of the medieval world were never meant to be remembered? That entire villages once vanished under the weight of feudal vengeance, their suffering deliberately erased from the chronicles that shaped our understanding of the Middle Ages? Imagine standing in a silent field where a rebellion once erupted, knowing that the ground beneath your feet hides stories so brutal that even the scribes of the time hesitated to record them. Would you still believe that medieval life was simply toil, hunger, and obedience? Or would you start wondering what horrors were kept from the pages of history? This video begins with a question that has haunted historians for generations. What did the feudal lords truly do to the peasants who dared to rise against them? Not the sanitized versions, not the polite summaries, but the real atrocities that were whispered in monasteries, buried in forbidden manuscripts, and hinted at only through the trembling quill of a chronicler who knew he would be punished for saying too much. Rebellious peasants were not merely punished. They were made examples, transformed into warnings carved into flesh, bone, and memory. And the more the peasants resisted, the more the lords refined their cruelty into something almost ritualistic. If you have ever wondered why medieval Europe remained so obedient for so long, the answer lies in these forgotten punishments. Behind every castle wall existed a system, designed to crush not only bodies, but spirits, something far more precise and far more chilling than simple violence. And the truth is that some of these methods were so psychologically destructive that even neighboring lords condemned them, calling them excessive, monstrous, unnatural. But the rebellions continued, and so the punishments escalated until fear itself became a weapon sharper than any sword. What you are about to discover may change the way you see medieval society entirely. These hidden acts of brutality were never meant to reach us, yet fragments survived, scattered across obscure chronicles and confiscated letters. And as we pull these fragments together, a darker and more disturbing picture emerges, one that reveals just how far the feudal machine would go to maintain control. You may find yourself asking whether humanity has truly changed, or if this hunger for domination simply evolved into new forms. What you think you know is only the surface. The deeper layers are where the real fear lies. So before we continue, tell me what you feel when you hear that even medieval chroniclers were afraid to write the truth. Have you ever imagined that history hides more cruelty than fiction ever could? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Make sure you understand the weight of what we are about to uncover. Hit the like button to help this kind of content reach more people, and check if you are already subscribed to the channel. What comes next might surprise you, and the transition into the next chapter will pull us even further into the hidden corridors of feudal terror, where silence was enforced not by law, but by fear itself. The fear that echoed through medieval villages did not begin with open revolt. It began quietly, long before the first torch was lit or the first pitchfork raised. It began in whispers, spoken behind barn doors, in glances exchanged at the edges of fields, in the slow, simmering realization that the weight placed on a peasant's back had finally exceeded what a human body could bear. When you look at the rebellions that shook medieval Europe, you never see a single moment of anger. You see decades of accumulation, pressure layered upon pressure, until desperation hardened into resolve. Peasants lived under obligations so suffocating that even breathing felt like debt. Every harvest owed to the Lord, every tool taxed, every animal counted like state property, every day consumed by duties stretching from sunrise to the moment exhaustion crushed them into sleep. But the greatest burden was not physical. It was knowing that no matter how hard they worked, they would never escape the grip of a system designed to keep them in place for life. That system was not merely an economy. It was a cage built from tradition, law, and fear. Lords understood this perfectly. They relied on silence, on the belief that peasants would endure anything as long as the cost of rebellion appeared worse than misery itself. But what, chroniclers recorded only in fragments, is that many lords lived with a fear they never voiced. They knew the numbers were not in their favour. A manor with 24 armoured retainers was surrounded by hundreds of peasants who laboured under constant humiliation. One spark inside that mass, one shared grievance, one moment of collective courage could overwhelm any fortress. And so, beneath the surface of the feudal world, a silent psychological war was always burning. This is why even small acts of resistance were treated with disproportionate brutality. A missing tax payment, an unfulfilled duty, a refusal to bow deeply enough could trigger punishments engineered not for justice, but for deterrence. The lords were not simply reacting to disobedience. They were preventing a possibility that terrified them, the awakening of peasant unity. They knew that if the peasants ever understood their own power, the entire hierarchy would collapse in a single season. So they enforced obedience with rituals of dominance that reached far beyond the visible punishments. What chroniclers rarely admitted is that rebellion was often born from the most human of motives. A lost child taken as collateral for unpaid dues. A winter hunger that pushed families beyond endurance. A lord's steward abusing his power for pleasure or profit. A widow stripped of her rights because she lacked male protection. These moments, scattered across generations, forged a shared memory of injustice that slowly united villages in rage. Men and women who had once bowed their heads began meeting at night, drawing plans in the dirt, speaking in tones that trembled with both fear and hope. Rebellions did not erupt because peasants wanted glory or power. They erupted because human dignity, crushed long enough, becomes combustible. And when that fire finally ignited, the lords knew the storm was coming long before the first shout echoed across their lands. What followed next was not strategy or negotiation. It was panic disguised as authority, cruelty sharpened by fear, and punishments crafted to extinguish the rebellion before it spread beyond control. And as we move deeper into this hidden history, the mechanisms of repression begin to reveal themselves with unsettling clarity, showing how every act of chastisement was part of a much larger, much darker system, waiting to consume anyone who dared challenge it. The machinery of repression that governed medieval Europe did not rely solely on swords, whips, or chains. It operated through something far more insidious, the careful construction of fear as a daily companion, the quiet certainty that someone was always watching, listening, and ready to report even the smallest sign of defiance. Long before a rebellion ever took form, the feudal lords built networks designed to detect disobedience at its earliest stages, networks woven into the fabric of village life itself. The system worked so effectively that most peasants never realized they were part of it. The steward, the bailiff, the reeve, these figures were not merely administrators. They were eyes and ears, chosen precisely because they lived close enough to the peasants to observe them, yet remained loyal to the lord's interests. Their authority blurred the line between administrative duty and personal power, granting them the ability to shape a peasant's fate with a single accusation. A whispered claim of insolence could mean a night in the stocks. A hint of discontent could mean days of forced labor. No rebellion needed to exist for punishment to descend. Suspicion alone was enough. But the brilliance of the feudal system lay not in the punishments themselves, but in how unpredictable they were. Lords intentionally avoided creating consistent rules. A peasant who spoke out one week might be ignored, while another who muttered the same words the next week might be dragged into the manor courtyard and beaten until he could no longer stand. This inconsistency was deliberate. It taught peasants that there was no safe boundary, no protected behavior, no predictable reaction. The absence of clear limits made fear limitless. Chroniclers rarely described this psychological component, not because it was unimportant, but because it was so deeply embedded in everyday life that it seemed unremarkable. Yet it was precisely this subtle terror that kept villages fractured. Peasants were discouraged from forming alliances, forbidden from gathering without oversight, and restricted from traveling without permission. Informal meetings became suspicious, shared grievances became dangerous. Every conversation carried the risk that one participant would repeat it to the steward in exchange for favor or protection. Even the church, which should have been a refuge, became entangled in this web. Priests owed their positions to local lords, and many became moral enforcers for feudal authority. A sermon could warn against rebellion as a sin, framing obedience not just as a duty, but as a divine command. Confession, intended to cleanse the soul, sometimes became a tool for gathering information. A penitent's fear of damnation could be turned into a confession that reached the Lord's ears by sunset. And when fear alone was not enough, the lords employed intimidation designed to resonate through generations. A single brutal punishment, staged in the village square, could echo in the minds of children who would still remember it decades later. They grew up, knowing what awaited anyone who dared defy the hierarchy, carrying that memory into adulthood, passing it down as a lesson, perhaps even as a warning to remain silent. This system of repression functioned like a shadow stretching over every field, every home, every conversation. It ensured that rebellion required more than courage. It required a willingness to risk not only one's life, but the safety of family, friends and neighbors. And as peasants weighed these risks, the lords continued, strengthening their methods, preparing harsher tools of control that would soon emerge openly, transforming this invisible intimidation into acts of punishment that scarred entire communities. When the first signs of unrest reached the manor, the response was never subtle. Feudal lords understood that the earliest act of rebellion, no matter how small, had to be crushed with a spectacle so unforgettable that it would echo across generations. The punishments they delivered were not simply about hurting the body. They were orchestrated events designed to fracture trust, dismantle unity, and remind every peasant watching that resistance carried a price far heavier than oppression itself. A single defiant act, refusing a tax, hiding a portion of grain, confronting a steward, was enough to unleash a carefully crafted ritual of intimidation. Public punishments were always staged at dawn, when the mist still clung to the ground and the eyes of the entire village could be gathered with little effort. The lord or his representative would choose a location that symbolized authority, the manor gate, the churchyard, the central crossroads. There, the accused was not treated as an individual, but as a symbol. The air would thicken as villagers were forced into a semicircle, compelled to witness what was about to unfold, their silence serving as both consent and confession of their powerlessness. The punishments varied from region to region, but the intention never changed. A peasant, suspected of sowing dissent, might be strapped to a wooden frame, exposed to the cold, while the steward listed his alleged crimes with theatrical precision. Another might be whipped until the ground beneath him turned dark with mud and blood. In some villages, the punishment involved mutilation, ears cut, hands branded, noses split, marks designed to be permanent reminders of defiance that would follow the victim for the rest of their life. And every villager understood that these marks were messages carved into human flesh, messages meant for everyone but addressed to no one directly. Sometimes the lords escalated the spectacle by involving the community. A rebellious peasant might be forced to kneel while neighbors were ordered to participate in the punishment, handing tools to the steward, assisting in restraints, or simply pointing out others who might be thinking the same thoughts. This strategy was devastating. It turned villagers into unwilling accomplices, poisoning their relationships, and ensuring that rebellion could not grow in soil watered with suspicion and shame. The lords understood that trauma shared in forced silence could fracture bonds that otherwise might have led to organized defiance. Chroniclers, when they dared mention these punishments at all, wrote about them with restraint, masking the brutality behind polite terminology. They spoke of disciplinary measures or necessary correction, glossing over the screams, the trembling, the way. Children clung to their mothers as they witnessed punishments designed to haunt their dreams. These writers feared the lords too, and their carefully chosen words leave us with only fragments of the terror that marked these communities. For the peasants, these spectacles became part of the rhythm of life. They learned to read the signs, the messenger riding in from the castle, the gathering of stewards, the hammering of wooden frames, the silence that fell before the first blow, and long after. The punished peasant was carried away. The memory lingered. It lingered in the fields where whispers returned, in the eyes of neighbors avoiding one another, in the knowledge that any one of them could be next if they failed to bow deeply enough or speak softly enough. These early punishments were only the beginning. As rebellions grew, the lords transformed cruelty into method, escalating their reprisals with a precision that seemed almost scientific in its coldness. And before we move deeper into that dark evolution, tell me in the comments what struck you most about how these communities were forced to witness such brutality, and which part of this hidden history resonates with you the most. What unfolded publicly in the village square was only the surface of a much deeper, far more deliberate system of repression. Behind the manor's stone walls existed another world entirely, one peasants spoke about only in frightened murmurs, a world designed not to be seen or remembered. These were the hidden chambers where punishments became experiments, where the lords and their appointed enforcers refined their methods away from the scrutiny of the community. Chroniclers avoided describing these places, not because they lacked information, but because the very act of acknowledging their existence threatened the fragile order the ruling class depended on. Every major estate had at least one such chamber, though some possessed networks of rooms linked by narrow passages carved into the earth. These were not dungeons in the fantasy sense. They were workspaces of intimidation, built with a cold practicality that revealed how deeply calculated feudal power truly was. A simple wooden door might hide a room where prisoners were suspended for hours, forced into positions designed to break both muscle and will. Another chamber might contain heavy stones used not for crushing bones outright, but for slowly compressing the chest, leaving victims gasping in a terror that lasted far longer than any visible wound. The tools used in these rooms were crafted by local blacksmiths under orders they dared not question. Restraints of iron, weighted cuffs, racks designed not for dramatic stretching but for subtle ligament damage, devices that inflicted pain without leaving marks a reeve could point to as improper cruelty. These methods allowed the lords to deny brutality outright, insisting that any injury a peasant carried afterward was the result of clumsiness or resistance. The silence surrounding these practices was not accidental. It was legislated, ritualized, even sanctified in the eyes of those who believed keeping order justified any means. And yet, what made these chambers most effective was not the physical violence they housed, but the uncertainty they created. Peasants never knew exactly what happened inside them, only that those who entered seemed to return, changed. Some came back unable to speak, as if words themselves had been beaten out of them. Others walked with stiff movements, their bodies adapting to pain that lingered for months. A few never returned at all, their fate swallowed by the manor's walls, their names spoken in whispers only when the night was deep and no steward lingered nearby. This secrecy gave the lords immense psychological leverage. When punishment remained invisible, imagination filled the void with horrors far beyond what any device could inflict. This fear became a weapon sharper than iron, allowing the lords to break rebellions before they formed. A single threat of being taken below could silence a bold voice, stop a whispered plan, or dissolve alliances before they took shape. As fear spread, so did isolation. Villagers withdrew from one another, uncertain of who might betray them if questioned by a steward or summoned to the manor. Few records of these chambers survive, and those that do often mask their true purpose behind vague phrases like the lower room or the place of correction. But through fragments of confiscated letters and the testimonies of those unlucky enough to endure such punishment, a picture emerges of a system designed not just to harm the body, but to dismantle the sense of self. This hidden world formed the spine of feudal control, a silent network of suffering that shaped the psychology of an entire era. And as rebellions grew louder, the lords soon turned to even harsher measures, escalating their reprisals into something far more devastating than anything that happened behind closed doors. Fear did not merely support the feudal system, it animated it, shaping every interaction between lord and peasant with an invisible force as powerful as any blade. By the time a peasant stepped into the manor courtyard, bowed their head in church, or walked past the steward's house, they were already acting under a pressure that had been meticulously engineered. Lords understood that true control required more than punishment. It required shaping the very thoughts of those who lived beneath them, bending perception until obedience felt like the only possible choice. And so, fear became more than a reaction. It became policy. The brilliance of this psychological dominance lay in its subtlety. Public punishments shocked the senses, but the true manipulation unfolded in quieter spaces, during a tax negotiation that left a family uncertain whether the steward's smile signaled mercy or a trap, or through rumors spread intentionally by the manors, retainers about what happened to other villages that dared resist. These whispers, repeated enough times, evolved into cautionary tales. Over years, they became truths no one questioned. Fear did not need to be proven daily. It only needed to be believed. Lords perfected the art of unpredictability. One day a peasant might be thanked for loyalty, offered bread or a kind word. The next day that same peasant might be summoned for questioning simply because the reeve heard a rumor that he hesitated before handing over grain. This oscillation between warmth and coldness created a mental fog that prevented clear judgment. When punishment could strike anyone at any moment for any reason, peasants became hesitant, compliant, self-policing long before the lord's authority intervened. In this state, rebellion became not only dangerous but unthinkable. Another method of psychological domination came through selective enforcement. The lords would occasionally allow minor disobedience to pass unpunished, watching who took notice, who whispered, who dared mimic the act. These tests revealed the bolder minds, the potential leaders of a revolt, individuals who needed to be isolated long before they gained influence. Once identified, these men and women were quietly targeted through humiliation, labor demands, or orchestrated disputes within the village. By degrading a potential leader's status publicly, lords ensured that others would hesitate to follow them. Even the environment itself became an instrument of control. The looming manor tower, visible from every direction, stood as a constant reminder of the hierarchy. Every road, every fence line, every field boundary was arranged to reinforce the idea that the land belonged to someone else. Peasants worked the soil, but the soil never belonged to them. This spatial dominance seeped into their consciousness, shaping how they saw themselves. They were perpetual outsiders on land their families had lived on for generations, always renting their place in the world through sweat and silence. Religious authority reinforced this psychological structure. Clergymen, dependent on the Lord's patronage, often used sermons to sanctify obedience, describing rebellion as a sin that invited divine wrath. Phrases about humility and submission became woven into the rhythm of village life. Even confession, meant to offer spiritual safety, could turn into a moment of vulnerability, a place where doubts could be coaxed. Out and reported, spiritual fear merged with earthly fear until resisting a lord felt akin to resisting heaven itself. Over time, peasants internalized this architecture of intimidation. They doubted their neighbors, distrusted themselves, questioned whether their suffering was a test, a punishment, or an immutable destiny. Their rebellion did not die. It suffocated beneath layers of dread, guilt, and the haunting awareness that the lords always seemed to know more than they should. Yet even this elaborate system had limits. As pressure mounted and small punishments escalated into brutal reprisals, fear ceased to suppress rebellion and instead began to fuel it. And when that shift occurred, the lords responded with a fury that reshaped the medieval landscape in ways chroniclers struggled to describe. When rebellion finally erupted, it rarely began with coordinated strategy or organized banners. It often started with a single spark, an insult delivered by a steward, a tax collector, pushed from a horse, a field seized in a moment of arrogance. But once the spark caught fire, it spread faster than any lord could extinguish. Entire regions would rise at once, driven by desperation that had simmered for decades. For a brief moment, peasants tasted the possibility of agency, the intoxicating belief that centuries of subjugation might be cast aside. Yet this hope lasted only as long as it took the Lord to mobilize his power. Retaliation was never limited to restoring order. It was designed to erase rebellion from memory by erasing the people who dared to dream of freedom. When a manor's soldiers returned after crushing an uprising, their orders were not merely to punish. They were instructed to dismantle the social fabric of the village itself. The first targets were always the leaders, the men and women who had spoken too boldly, who had been seen offering guidance, who had been whispered about as the minds behind the revolt. These individuals were singled out with a precision that proved the lords had been watching them long before the rebellion began. Once identified, they were subjected to punishments meant to terrify anyone who witnessed them. Some were dragged behind horses across the fields they once tended. Others were hanged at village entrances, their bodies left to sway in the wind for days as a warning to travelers and returning peasants alike. But the most psychologically devastating tactic was the targeted destruction of family lines. A rebellious man might lose not only his life, but the land his parents had worked, the tools his sons would inherit, the security his daughters depended on. This erasure of legacy was intentional. It ensured that no surviving member could rebuild the hope he once embodied. Entire households were sometimes relocated or scattered across distant estates, breaking the connections that allowed rebellion to spread in the first place. Marriages arranged, children reassigned to labor elsewhere, widows forbidden from remarrying without the Lord's approval. In this way, the aftermath of rebellion extended far beyond the battlefield. It seeped into domestic life, altering family structures and weakening the communal bonds that had once given peasants their greatest strength. Survivors who had taken part in the uprising faced a different kind of punishment. Many were forced into public confessions, reciting rehearsed admissions crafted by the Lord's officials. These confessions served two purposes: to establish the Lord's narrative as the only truth, and to brand the rebels as sinners rather than victims. Others were spared visible punishment, but watched closely for years afterward, their every movement scrutinized, their every word measured. Living under such surveillance was its own form of torture, a constant reminder that rebellion might cost them more the second time than it had the first. Chroniclers rarely described these retaliations in full detail. Some feared retribution. Others believed recounting such brutality would stir sympathy for the peasants, which was considered politically dangerous. As a result, the historical record reflects only fragments, shadows of the true horror. But in those fragments, we can trace the outlines of a system built not to defeat rebellion quickly, but to prevent it from being remembered. And that erasure, more than any torture chamber or battlefield, ensured the feudal order would endure generation after generation. Now, tell me in the comments, what struck you about the way these retaliations targeted not just individuals, but entire families and communities, and how this systematic silencing reshaped the lives of all who survived. For centuries, the official version of feudal history was shaped not by the events themselves, but by those who recorded them. Chroniclers, monks, court scribes, itinerant writers held the power to preserve or bury the truth. Their quills determined what future generations would believe about rebellions, punishments, and the conduct of lords. Yet these men lived under the same shadow that hung over the peasants they described. They depended on the patronage of the powerful, and the lines they wrote could determine whether they received bread and shelter or faced accusations of slander and sedition. In this precarious balance, silence often became a survival strategy. The chronicles that survive from the period offer a carefully curated image of feudal justice. They speak of order restored, of sinners punished, of rebellious villages chastened. They mention the Lord's firm hand, the peasants' foolish disobedience, and the necessary measures taken to uphold peace. But beneath these sanitized phrases, faint traces of unease bleed through. A scribe might mention an action he cannot describe because it grieves the heart, or refer to excesses better left unspoken. These vague lines beckon us toward events that the chronicler witnessed or heard whispered in cloistered halls, but dared not detail. Some chroniclers kept private journals hidden from the eyes of patrons. These fragments, discovered centuries later in monastic archives, reveal a darker world entirely. They hint at punishments far crueler than the public spectacles described in official accounts. Punishments delivered behind locked doors, in forest clearings, and in abandoned farmhouses repurposed for torment. One monk wrote of a village where every man over the age of 15 was forced to crawl before the Lord's horse, and those who stumbled were beaten until bone showed through torn flesh. Another recorded the aftermath of a rebellion in which the surviving women were denied burial rites for their husbands unless they confessed the names of every man who had shouted during the uprising. These secret writings also capture the chronicler's own fear. One scribe described burning his notes after witnessing a punishment he said no Christian soul should behold, fearing that if the Lord discovered what he had written, he would be accused of treason. Another chronicler admitted altering his texts after a steward questioned whether he had portrayed the Lord with sufficient respect. He rewrote entire sections overnight, transforming scenes of brutality into narratives of paternal discipline. Even more revealing are the omissions themselves, the sudden gaps in manuscripts, the pages torn from bound volumes, the abrupt shifts in tone that suggest passages removed under pressure. In one chronicle, a detailed account of a peasant revolt ends abruptly with the phrase, "There are things which must not be written here." The following pages are blank. Historians suspect censorship, but the reason is clear. To describe what happened would have been to condemn the lords in ways the chronicler simply would not survive. These hidden, partial, and deliberately muted accounts show that the brutality of feudal retaliation was not unknown. It was merely forbidden to speak of it openly. The chroniclers lived in a world where truth itself could be punished, where writing too honestly about the misery of peasants could be interpreted as siding with them. And so, what remains to us today is not history as it was lived, but history as it was allowed to be remembered. Yet even through the cautious language and careful omissions, the shadows of the truth remain, revealing more through their absence than their presence. The consequences of feudal brutality did not fade. With the end of a rebellion or the death of a lord, they seeped into the foundations of medieval society, shaping not only how peasants lived, but how they thought, remembered, and taught their children to navigate a world that could turn hostile with no warning. Every act of violence, whether public spectacle, hidden torment, or unrecorded atrocity, left marks that extended beyond the individuals who suffered them. These marks accumulated generation after generation, becoming an inherited memory of fear that molded entire communities into patterns of submission long after the original wounds had healed. Many peasants grew up never having witnessed rebellion themselves, yet they felt its consequences in every aspect of daily life. The caution that governed their speech, the silence that surrounded certain topics, the wary glances exchanged when a steward approached, these behaviors were passed down as instinct rather than choice. Children learned early that questioning authority was dangerous, that loyalty was demanded rather than earned, and that survival depended on anticipating the desires of those above them. This internalized fear became a self-sustaining force, a psychological inheritance that ensured the feudal structure required little active enforcement to remain intact. The social landscape itself bore the imprint of this inherited fear. Villages were divided into subtle hierarchies based on who had cooperated during past reprisals and who had been punished. Families known to have been involved in rebellions often carried a quiet stigma for decades, their names associated with danger even when no one alive remembered the details of the original defiance. Marriages were arranged to avoid these families. Alliances bypassed them. In this way, the Lord's strategy of fragmenting communities continued to function long after the original enforcers had died, sustained by the villagers themselves through habit and inherited caution. Even agricultural practices reflected the long shadow of repression. Fields abandoned after uprisings were sometimes left uncultivated for years, not because the soil was poor, but because the memory of what happened there made peasants uneasy. Forest paths once used for secret meetings were avoided. Wells associated with punitive drownings earned reputations as cursed. Landscapes became living archives of trauma, shaping the movements and decisions of generations who had never directly suffered the original. Of violence, the Church too played a role in maintaining this cycle. Priests who had survived past reprisals preached obedience as a moral necessity, reinforcing the message that rebellion brought divine judgment in addition to earthly punishment. Sermons invoked past uprisings as cautionary tales, framing the suffering that followed as the natural outcome of sinful pride rather than systemic cruelty. Over time, these religious narratives blended with folk memory, producing a worldview in which resistance felt not only futile, but morally suspect. And yet beneath this surface of submission, a quieter transformation was taking place. As each generation inherited the stories of brutality, they also inherited something more subtle, a growing understanding of the system's fragility. They learned that lords feared them more than they admitted, that violence was the answer only because dialogue was impossible, and that every rebellion, no matter how brutally crushed, had exposed the vulnerabilities of feudal power. This dual memory, fear layered upon recognition, became the seed of later upheavals that would eventually crack the system open. The feudal world survived for centuries, not simply because lords wielded power, but because that power had been internalized by those beneath them. Yet even as submission became tradition, rebellion never disappeared entirely. It lingered like a dormant ember, waiting for conditions that would allow it to ignite once more, reshaping the course of history and reminding the world that no system built on fear remains unchallenged forever. The violence that shaped the medieval world did not vanish when the last feudal rebellion was crushed or when a new lord inherited a manor. It lingered in the structure of society itself, embedded in laws that outlived their authors and customs that outlived their witnesses. Even when the brutality faded from everyday practice, its imprint remained like a shadow cast across centuries. Villages, rebuilt after destruction, grew into communities defined by caution. Families whose ancestors suffered reprisals carried an invisible weight that shaped their place in the social order. And the stories, even the ones never written down, traveled through generations in whispers that warned children of the dangers of challenging power too openly. The chroniclers who chose silence unknowingly contributed to this legacy. By omitting the full extent of feudal cruelty, they preserved the illusion of order that lords depended upon. Their partial accounts created a distorted memory of the Middle Ages, one where rebellion appeared foolish, where suffering seemed inevitable, where the choices of peasants were interpreted as submission rather than survival. These omissions shaped not only medieval understanding, but modern interpretations, leaving us with a history that often feels incomplete, softened, or stripped of the human cost that defined it. Yet the remnants of this hidden violence still surface in surprising ways. In archaeological digs, researchers occasionally find objects buried hastily after uprisings, broken tools, scorched beams, coins hoarded for escape. Written between the lines of surviving documents are hints of fear that no official account dare explain. The emotional residue of these centuries still clings to abandoned settlements, to place names associated with loss, and to the ghostly pattern of fields left uncultivated long after danger passed. These traces form an unwritten archive of the feudal world, revealing that repression was not simply an event, but a landscape, a rhythm, a condition of existence. Over time, small acts of defiance persisted. A steward found dead under suspicious circumstances. A tithe quietly withheld. A village relocating overnight to escape a particularly cruel lord. These moments, minor when viewed individually, created currents beneath the surface of society. Currents that eroded the foundations of feudalism slowly, almost imperceptibly. And when larger political changes finally arrived centuries later, sweeping away the structures that once seemed immovable, they did so on soil already loosened by generations who quietly learned that fear could be endured, resisted, and eventually overcome. The legacy of feudal cruelty is not simply one of suffering. It is also a testament to endurance, to the quiet resilience of those who lived under systems designed to break them. Their stories, whether recorded, suppressed, or carried only in memory, form the unseen backbone of medieval history. And even now, as we piece together the fragments they left behind, we uncover truths that challenge the sanitized versions long accepted as fact, reminding us that the past is far darker, far more complex, and far more human than the chronicles ever allowed. Before we close this chapter, if you reached this point, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end, so I know you journeyed through the shadows with me." If the depth and honesty of this story meant something to you, consider subscribing so you can keep exploring these hidden corners of history with me. A like helps keep these forgotten voices alive, but only if it feels natural to you. And if you want to continue this dive into the darker side of the past, there's another video waiting for you right here beside this one. Click it and follow me into the next forgotten truth.